It is great to be here this morning and great to participate in the John Curtin Institute and the discussion series that it holds. So I'm very pleased to contribute to that. I've been to WA on countless occasions. I can't remember how many, but it's at least 100, I think. I have fond memories when I was first here. It was in 1970 as a student laying pipes for some town that was being built down south. I can't remember the town, which is probably just as well. And it was those days when you could be on a building site and all you had to wear was a pair of boots and a pair of shorts. So I came away with a wonderful tan and what passes for someone with a frame like I've got is some muscles. And we spent the whole time listening to all 5 test matches being broadcast by Alan McGilvray over the ABC radio. So I'm not quite sure how the pipes turned out, but we certainly enjoyed the cricket and had a wonderful time. But as I say, I've been here on many, many occasions and I enjoy coming over to Perth. There's a lot I could talk about today because, as you know, we're responsible for competition, regulation, consumer regulation and infrastructure issues. And I think we gave you a title that covered all 3 only because we hadn't worked out what we were going to talk about then when you asked for the title. So what I thought I'd do is just talk very briefly about some of the main competition and consumer things in front of us and then spend most of the time talking about a couple of infrastructure issues. And I'll try and do that in a way that leaves enough time for questions so that I can cover off anything that's of interest to the audience, because that's probably much more useful for you. So our role in competition covers, so as I say, we're responsible for competition law, consumer law and or regulation, and the regulation largely of monopoly infrastructure. Our role in competition covers enforcement issues, merger assessments and authorisations. And so our enforcement efforts are aimed at ensuring there's no breaches of the Act in relation to cartel conduct, agreements that lessen competition and misuse of market power. Indeed, I always say with our Act, the relevant textbooks go for about 1,000 pages, but you could write the essence of the Act on the back of a postage stamp. The concepts are pretty straightforward. As our most recent example of an enforcement competition activity was last month, we announced federal court proceedings against 2 businesses alleging they were engaged in anti-competitive conduct, including cartel conduct in selling liquefied petroleum gas in the Sydney metropolitan area. Our role in mergers sees us dealing with about 300 transactions a year. It's always interesting with mergers. The vast bulk of them sail through pretty quickly. You don't even know they came up. But then there's 2 or 3 which the whole world knows about because they attract an enormous amount of media attention. The current transaction that's attracting a fair bit of attention is the Seven Group's proposed acquisition of Consolidated Media Holdings. And today we've just announced that we're releasing a statement of issues in relation to that, in which we express our preliminary competition concerns, given that the transaction could see the Seven Group having a substantial interest, obviously not only in Channel 7, but also in Fox Sports Australia. And our concern is, our concerns arise in the free-to-air television market, given the influence Channel 7 may then be able to exert over Fox Sports Australia in joint bids for sports rights, the potential for that to have an advantage over other free-to-air stations. And of course our main authorisation activity is the Qantas Emirates deal, which you all know about unless you've been hiding under a rock. Last Friday, Qantas and Emirates applied for authorisation from the ACCC to integrate and coordinate their international networks. Now this will involve Qantas operating its European services via Dubai rather than Singapore so that it can integrate into the Emirates network. But the arrangement will also have implications for Trans-Tasman routes and will involve the parties' code sharing globally, including in Asia. Now they're seeking interim authorisation so that they can plan and negotiate the details of the arrangements, and they're aiming to have the arrangements start in April 2013. Now the authorisation process is a very public process. We seek submissions on the likely public benefits and likely anti-competitive detriments, and submissions are due on October 1, and there'll be submissions sought on the interim authorisation request as well, which are due on the 21st of September. And all public submissions will of course go on our website. At this stage we plan to issue a draft decision in December before making a final decision in the first quarter of 2013. There's a 6-month statutory time frame applying to the assessment of authorisation applications, and large and complex transactions like this will typically take the full 6 months. Now, as most of you will know, we grant authorisation if the likely benefits to the public outweigh the likely anti-competitive detriments. I mean, sometimes with authorisations people say, well, can't you see it's anti-competitive? And I say, well, yes, it's an authorisation. That's why we authorise. Our Act, rather uniquely in the world, allows us to authorise things that would otherwise be in breach of the Act if someone applies to have the behaviour authorised and we judge there are net public benefits. And so the benefits of the arrangements are benefits to the broader travelling public, not benefits to the individual parties, and that again gets confused mostly by the relevant parties. I haven't faced that yet with Qantas and Emirates because we've only had early discussions, but I have some fond memories of previous authorisations where getting people to distinguish between public benefits and their benefits was extremely hard and, as I say, sometimes amusing. So that's what we have to be looking at, and this is, the issue is someone says, here's a benefit from what's going to happen, and you've got to say, well, can you get that benefit any other way? It may be a benefit to the proposer, but is it a wider public benefit? So that's what that's going to be about. I've heard some people say that it should be very quick and easy. Well, it's not, and it won't be. It'll take time. I'm not signalling anything about the outcome. I'm just signalling that this is the beginning of a process that will take a bit of time. So just moving on from competition issues to consumer regulation, and again, that essentially involves misrepresentations to consumers. There's a large number of provisions in the Act which word that in various ways, but that's essentially what the Australian consumer law is trying to stop. And of course we deal with product safety issues as well. Probably our main current consumer protection case involves Google. We took action against Google. We lost it at first instance in the federal court. We appealed to the full federal court, which concluded that Google had indeed created misleading messages through its technology in response to users' search queries. The High Court has granted Google leave to appeal, and that leave was heard this week in the High Court, and judgments reserved. The issue is how much responsibility should Google have for representations that are made using their software, where you can have a situation where you can search for company A and end up on the website of company B because company A paid for the privilege. Excuse me. So now I want to move on to our third area of responsibility in relation to infrastructure regulation, and I'll probably spend more time there. And, we are a combined regulator, and that really has an enormous amount of spin-off benefits because the overlap between excuse me, competition issues and regulatory issues is really strong, particularly when you consider that prior to the HILMA Part 3A access regime, a lot of those issues were dealt with under Part 4 of the Competition Act, so they're very closely related issues. So today I want to draw out what I think are some of the desired features of regulatory arrangements and then apply them to some particular matters, some of which are also fairly high profile, that we have under consideration. So I'm going to deal with 4 things. One is just talk about the desirability of, whenever you can, introducing incentives into regulation, and I'll pick that up in relation to the regulatory arrangements that may well apply to the NBN. Secondly, I want to talk about the role of consumers and users in formulating regulatory decisions, and I'll do that a little bit in relation to NBN, but also regulating wheat ports, which is obviously an issue in WA, but also regulating energy networks, which is an issue all around Australia. I'll then talk a little bit about effective demand management, using electricity and urban transport as examples, and then I'll talk a little bit about Part 3A, given that the High Court's about to announce its famous Pilbara decision tomorrow. I must say, the Pilbara thing's been going on for so long, I'm a little upset that it's coming to a conclusion. I was wondering whether someone might actually be able still to appeal to the Privy Council to keep it running, but I was told that that can't happen. Just talking about the NBN and trying to introduce incentives. The regulatory arrangements for the NBN have been occupying us over the past 12 months. Obviously, the right access settings are crucial. Firstly, to ensure that you avoid the normal pitfalls of having a monopoly, higher prices, inefficient investment, poor service quality, which is potential pitfalls that can arise whenever you have a monopoly. So try to do our best to minimise those potential effects. And then, at least as important, making sure that it facilitates robust competition in the downstream market, so that you get competition not just between Telstra, Optus, iiNet and TPG, but also potentially new players. So it's important for those two reasons, the operation of the monopoly asset itself and the ability to facilitate competition. Now, NBNco submitted a special access undertaking late last year. It was subject to a lot of consultation, and it became very clear from that consultation and the ACCC's own assessment that the undertaking required a lot of restructuring. And as NBNco itself acknowledged, the various responses they got to it focused on the nature and extent of the ACCC oversight over the 30-year term of the SAU and the level of certainty provided to retailers as compared to the level of flexibility provided to NBN. Accordingly, NBN this week has withdrawn the undertaking. However, recognising the significance of the feedback received by NBN's customers and the ACCC, in June, a couple of months ago, NBN gave the ACCC an outline, which is available on our website, of a revised SAU, and we expect that outline to be turned into a new access undertaking, which should be formally lodged in hopefully in coming weeks. Now, the NBN has noted that the revised SAU will commit it to maintaining the affordability of prices, with the prices of key products being locked in for 5 years, and the inclusion of price controls over all its products. We would hope that the revised SAU strikes a better balance between providing NBN the long-run certainty they need for investment, but also the flexibility for other access terms to evolve over time. A key challenge with the regulatory arrangements for the NBN will be in creating strong incentives for NBNco to continue to meet customers' strongly increasing data needs at a reasonable cost. And the issue is how we go about doing that. Now, as you all know, usually the way regulation applies is you allow a regulated rate of return on the approved asset base and set prices accordingly. In this way, regulated monopolies can be largely guaranteed their regulated rate of return irrespective of how they perform. A key difference, and this is absolutely crucial, between the NBN and those established infrastructure, other established infrastructure monopolies, is that the NBN will incur significant upfront costs to build the network, and customers will only progressively be put onto the network as the rollout is undertaken. It follows that in the early days, applying a rate of return on the capital and trying to get that revenue covered by prices paid for the small number of users will lead to excessive prices. So in response, NBNco has proposed that it will fix some prices broadly at what consumers are willing to pay for broadband services. The key question that we'll need to consider is how many prices do you need to fix and for how long? Because it's possible to imagine that if you fix key prices for sufficiently long, then the only way that NBNco will ever make its regulated rate of return is if it builds capacity to provide the higher speeds, that is, it's actively seeking to promote higher speeds and get customers onto them, and that people continue to demand more data. That is, if NBNco charges broadband users similar prices to what they pay today for what they are actually getting today, it will only earn enough revenue to cover its costs if there's much higher demand for data that the NBN is actually being built to actually supply. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. What is clear, however, is that the discussion of the regulatory arrangements for the NBN are likely to focus heavily on the incentives they create for NBNco to behave in ways that lead to positive outcomes for consumers. And as I explained, that unique situation of having it being built gives us much more scope for incentives than we normally have. My second topic is the role of infrastructure users and consumers in setting regulatory arrangements. Now, I've been on to this theme for some time. I think consumers are way underrepresented in regulatory decisions, and I'll give you some insight into why I say that. So I've just said that NBN will be lodging a new structural access undertaking soon, and that will trigger discussions with users, and getting effective input from those users will be essential to achieving an appropriate structural undertaking. That's why some people say to me, well, how quickly will we get the undertaking approved? And I'm saying, well, we've got to go through this consultation process. There's big users here, they'll express their views. That's going to lead to discussion, and it is going to take a bit of time. But the crucial thing is we've got to get it right. So it's quite easy if you've got the desire to get users involved in NBN regulatory decisions. Likewise, I just thought I'd say a little bit about wheat ports, which is another topic I'm very interested in, and then I'll get onto energy networks under this same heading. So we currently have a quite specific role at the ACCC in regulating wheat ports. The government identified access to wheat ports as an important consideration in the dismantling of the AWB's single desk arrangements. In moving from a monopoly to competition in the export and marketing of bulk wheat, the government was concerned that the port operators could assume positions of power and themselves dominate the wheat export market in their regions by leveraging their ownership of the bottleneck port infrastructure. I mean, a classic infrastructure access situation. The government addressed this concern by requiring the operators of port facilities, who also exported wheat, so they were vertically integrated, to provide access undertakings to the ACCC under Part 3A of our Act. Now, these undertakings provide the terms and conditions on which the vertically integrated port operators can provide access to their wheat exporting competitors. The reforms have resulted in over 20 traders entering the market for export wheat, which means more competition for the produce of Australia's wheat farmers. The Wheat Export Marketing Amendment Bill, which is currently before the Australian Parliament, would remove the requirement for those access undertakings. The bill provides that access undertakings will not be required by 2014 if the industry can develop an acceptable voluntary code of conduct to govern those access issues. Now, in order to be approved by the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, the voluntary code, I think, needs to include key elements from the existing compulsory undertakings, and most important, will need to meet the needs of those exporters who are competing with the players who own the bottleneck facilities. So the key point for me is that the government, I think, has recognised that alternative arrangements to those applying now will only work if they satisfy the needs of the exporters who need access to the bottleneck infrastructure. And I think this is a very important factor to put into the regulatory decision making. It's not enough that those who own the bottleneck facilities come together and get agreement on a code of conduct. You've actually got to make sure the users are completely comfortable, and in my view, if they're not, the current arrangements should prevail. So crucial that the users are seen there as equal participants in the decision making, as I say, as they will be with the NBN. When we turn to the regulation of electricity networks, we find a different story, and of course, electricity networks is just a massive story right across Australia. People talk to me occasionally about why have we got so many cost of living concerns. Well, I just say to them, have a look at what's happened to electricity prices. In New South Wales, where I live, they've more than doubled in the last 5 years. In nominal terms, they've gone up by 80% in real terms, and that's a shock to anybody, particularly if you're on low incomes. So electricity networks matter because they're what's been driving the growth in prices. Nothing to do with gas prices, coal prices. It's a network story. And so with the NBN and the wheat ports, you've got large users who can make their views known. You've got to let them into the tent, but once in, they'll make their views known very clearly. It's a different story, however, with electricity networks when most users are quite small and indeed mainly consist of households. How do we get their voices heard? Now, this has been a key area of concern in recent years for the ACCC, the AER, Australian Energy Regulator, and other state-based regulators. And traditionally, when regulating energy networks, and I know the AER doesn't have responsibility for the WA situation, but I think the AER and the local regulator operate in a pretty similar way, so these comments are equally applicable, I would guess. The AER only gets effective input in its regulatory decision-making from companies that own the monopoly infrastructure and are actually seeking the higher prices, and from some well-organised large users. This leaves the important voices of smaller users, especially households, unheard. Now, there are two important changes that I think are absolutely fundamental, and fundamental to the whole debate about electricity prices. First, rather than have the electricity network company put in their proposals to the regulator largely unseen, they should be required in the first instance to put out proposals to the public, hold meetings with the public, hopefully with options that said, well, we can spend this much and you get these outcomes and this will be the effect on price, or we can spend that much and you get these outcomes and this is the effect on price, and have the debate. The draft rules that cover national electricity regulation, which recently released by the AEMC, would facilitate such a step, as I say, in the East Coast. The second step is that, but the suggestion I'm making is equally applicable here. Second, there needs to be a well-funded consumer body with appropriate technical expertise that can engage in each step of the regulatory process to ensure that the voices of small users are heard. And you can see those two steps are complementary. You can't have one without the other. These changes have the potential to greatly improve regulatory outcomes. When regulators are reaching their conclusions on network pricing, in my view, it's crucial that they have input not just from those seeking the higher prices, but from all affected parties, so that decisions can be well balanced. It's very difficult as the regulator if you're only getting views from one side. Let me just talk about demand management reasonably briefly. Of course, demand management is absolutely fundamental for infrastructure networks, and it's an issue that I think is not sufficiently recognised, even though it's completely logically true, because you build a network to cater for peak demand. Most of the rest of the time it's unused, and so your electricity network has got to be built to cater for the maximum demand which occurs for 1 minute a year. Your road has to be built for peak hour and morning and peak. You can drive down midnight down the wrong lane if you want, and you'll not hit another car. So the peakier the demand, the higher the cost of providing the infrastructure, and the more users will have to pay for it. In the electricity sector, although demand is falling, it's falling because the prices are going through the roof. What else did people expect? Peak use has been steadily rising, which drives the need for more network investment. Now, there aren't any easy solutions, but there's some debates with electricity networks that have to be taken on, I think. The first is, how much should we rely on? So we need to do something about demand management in electricity. The question is, how do we do it? One question is, do we rely on market solutions or non-market solutions? And that's a debate I just want to pose rather than answer. But market-based solutions would require customers responding to price signals to shift their demand to reduce pressures at peak times. This requires smart meters, and it requires retail peak period pricing. It requires retailers to offer contracts that expose consumers to price signals. The alternative approach, or another approach, and maybe it's a complementary approach, is to have more direct control of load, just like they used to do in the old vertically integrated days, to force consumers to reduce load at peak times. A second issue is the role of regulated monopolies in driving innovation and demand management. While the network businesses currently don't have any real incentive to address peak demand, They do control much of the critical infrastructure and information required to implement any solution. So the difficult issue is how much you want network businesses to provide demand management services to consumers in what would be effective competition with retailers and other third-party providers. And both those debates, I think, are causing a lot of discussion and, while not solved, are preventing us moving forward on electricity demand management. Now, the issue of demand management in relation to urban transport is, in a sense, conceptually much easier. But most governments have ruled out demand management to reduce the ever-rising costs of urban traffic congestion, and I think that's a shame. I believe that the issue of congestion charging, while of course contentious, must be addressed, because while congestion charging is contentious, so increasingly is the issue of traffic gridlock. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. If you've seen any model of which all road traffic authorities have, the one in Perth will have it, the one in Melbourne has it, the one in Sydney have it. They've got models of road congestion, and it's heading north with all the models, unless you can't build enough roads to avoid it, because you can't build enough roads to get everybody into the centre of the city unless you go underground. Now, the thing about congestion charging is not only would it smooth out the peaks of road use, it could also help us address the issue of how we pay for urban transport infrastructure. The losses usually incurred on public transport are now so large that state treasuries, understandably, are resistant to expanding the public transport network. The more they provide it, the more money they're going to lose. They don't lose money on people getting in cars, they lose money on people getting on the train. Sounds weird. But some combination, I believe, of appropriate congestion charging on roads, careful use of the revenue that congestion charging would provide, and of course increased efficiency, I think, is needed to address Australia's growing transport problem. And I guess the key point I'm making is demand management matters when you've got infrastructure networks, and roads are an infrastructure network. Look, my last issue, so that I keep very much to time, is just talking a bit about the Part 3A access regulation, and to me the issue there is all about the timeliness of decision making. In the early 1990s, as I said, the way to deal with infrastructure and competition in upstream or downstream markets from that infrastructure was under Section 46 of our Act, Misuse of Market Power. However, it wasn't really a very effective instrument for dealing with access to infrastructure issues, and in responding to that, the Hilmer Review in the early 90s recommended that what is now Part 3A come about, the Part 3A access regime. Now, the Part 3A regime has facilitated competitive outcomes. There have been around 20 declaration applications where people have applied to get access to someone else's infrastructure, 25 declaration applications since 1995, many of which have facilitated the parties reaching a commercial agreement. The best example was Sydney Airport, where Virgin couldn't reach agreement with Sydney Airport. They applied for declaration, they got it. That facilitated a negotiation. There was nothing the ACCC ever had to do. It just evened up the bargaining power. But the problem with Part 3A is it's been associated with very lengthy and expensive review processes, and these delays create uncertainty and increased costs for the parties involved, and at a broader level they undermine the credibility and effectiveness of the national access regime. Now, of course, the Pilbara case, which I talked about, which is going to be decided in the High Court tomorrow, is the classic. It's been running for 7 years, and as I say, many of us have had it as a core part of our lives for so long, there'll be a bit of a depression setting in when the issue's finally over. But 7 years is too long. We have to find a way to streamline the Part 3A processes. The key issue the High Court's going to rule on, which everybody who's following the case is exceptionally keen to find out an answer to, is the issue of what is uneconomic to duplicate. Does it have to be what's known in economics as a natural monopoly, or is it sufficient that someone else would find it profitable to build another asset? So the High Court will rule on that tomorrow. Now, we've got the Productivity Commission review into the national access regime, and one issue I'm hoping that's on the table is how do we streamline the process. I think having a Part 3A regime is absolutely needed, but you've got to have a process for getting decisions out a lot quicker than 7 years. The parties otherwise just move on. So look, in conclusion, we at the ACCC have a very rich agenda of issues that we're dealing with at the moment. We're obviously very closely involved with NBN and closely involved with energy network regulation issues, and exactly how those issues turn out will have a big influence on everybody. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions on any topic, including the football.
Thanks, Dale Pinto from Curtin University. Thanks, Rod. Really enjoyed your wide-ranging address. My question does relate to petrol pricing boards and the prospect of national standards. As we all know, concerns continue to be raised about the prominent display of discounted petrol prices on fuel boards, which may be misleading consumers. So my question against that background is, in your view, what's the desirability and likelihood of a national approach being taken to boards, fuel boards under the Australian consumer law?
Look, thanks for that. I think the Can you hear me all right? Oh, yeah, sorry. Is quite high. The problem we've noticed at the ACCC is that you've got just this range of price boards, some of which do breach the Act by, for example, displaying essentially only the discounted price, which means you drive into the service station thinking you're getting petrol for $1.30, only to find you'll get it for $1.30 if you've got a 10-cent supermarket voucher. But otherwise, if you don't, you're going to pay $1.40. And that is misleading. Other boards, though, it's a complex issue. You can see how consumers are going to be confused. It's not a breach of the Act. I mean, people are driving by these things day and night. You want them to get accurate information. We've formed the view that it's too hard to try and sort that out by, taking cases to court. It's better just to set a standard, and so having a reasonably simple standard that everybody would have to adhere to would be the best outcome. So we're supporting the standard. I think the Commonwealth is. I know New South Wales is. I think other states probably will, although they haven't all formed a view. The issue is, can they agree on what a common standard should be? It's ultimately a decision for ministers. But I think the prospects are quite good. That we'll get a quite simple standard, which in essence says display the undiscounted prices. If you want to add things, you maybe can, but you've got to actually make it clear what the undiscounted price is. So I think it's going to happen.
Hello, Peter Ryan from Department of Transport. Just wondering if you could just reflect on some of the airport regulatory oversight role that you have, particularly in terms of commentary around the under-provision of capital into Australia's airports, particularly I'm thinking here of Perth Airport. And I'm just wondering if there's going to be any changes to the ACCC regime around oversight of airports?
Look, a very good question, and it's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating issue. Airports were privatised in various ways. Prior to privatisation, as you know better than I do, I'm sure, but for the rest of the audience, there was all airports were price controlled. Now, I think most people think that was way too intrusive, having to set the prices that airports could charge airlines. But those price controls were gradually removed. In Sydney, they were removed just as the airport was sold. So because of that, it went for about double the price. I think that was a neat trick by the Department of Finance. And just as an aside, I think it probably gives privatisation a bad name, because then everybody links privatisation with higher prices, whereas in the case of Sydney Airport, and sorry to be Sydney focused, but it was the classic case of price controls being moved. They paid this enormous amount, and lo and behold, up went all the prices. So it was just really a wealth transfer, and when you associate that with privatisation, naturally people out there think whenever you privatise something, prices have got to go up, which doesn't have to be the case, and certainly wasn't the case with privatisation of electricity in Victoria. Anyway, that's to diverge. So one issue that we've been concerned about has been whether it's better to do with airports what we've in fact done with wheat export ports, that is, require them to give an undertaking around which terms they would provide access to airlines. Now, the traditional argument back is no, if the airlines want access, they'll go through the Part 3A process. I think it took Virgin 5 years to get that through. I could be wrong, but it was something like that. And where you've got an airport, which is a straight-out common user facility, it's not clear to me that you need to go through a 5-year process to get access to it. My own personal view is it'd be better if we had a process that required undertakings. Now, if the airport, I mean, those undertakings shouldn't be difficult to reach agreement around, and if the airports are right that they don't have as much market power as some think, then the undertaking's a pretty easy thing to give, so it sort of sorts itself out. So that's around pricing, which is not what you asked about. But pricing does, I think, sometimes also affect investment decisions. I mean, if you've got a monopoly that's got market power, that can translate, as we all know, in theory. I'm not making a direct accusation here, I'm just saying the theory of monopolies is they can raise prices or they can lower service. If you've got a monopoly, that's what you can do to maximise your profits. So whether a lack of airport regulation has led to underinvestment, I think is an interesting issue. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it is an interesting issue that needs to be explored. The issue that's now occurring, of course, is, which maybe you're referring to even more, is having privatised the airports, they could, in many ways, live off a lot of the investment, and now some of them are being required to invest a lot of money to expand their airport. And look, I have been brought up to date on what's going on at Perth Airport, but right off the top of my head, I'm not on top of that, so I apologise for that. But I do know there's a big issue over airport expansion. I'm just not quite sure where it's up to. But in some other cities, there is a bit of a standoff as you want to increase, you want to greatly expand the airport capacity, undertake investments worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of investment, and then the question of who's going to pay for that and how you get that back from the users has caused a bit of friction at some of the airports. I don't know whether that's the issue you're referring to here. The airlines, of course, are used to flying into Singapore or Seoul, and as someone who's recently flown into both those airports, of course, they're magnificent things. You could play a game of Aussie rules football in the main stadium, even on a peak day, and still not run into anybody. And so they're massively government funded, and the airlines are still pushing back on how much they have to fund that, now belatedly realising that governments have got out of the way. So a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think the whole question of how we fund airport upgrades is going to come on the regulatory table as well. To answer your question directly, none of that has manifested itself in a way that has anybody particularly suggesting a role for us at the moment, but that debate is still live and may pop out at any time. But there's nothing going on at the moment that suggests a greater role for us. At the moment, our role is negligible. We do a report on airports, so we've got an airport monitoring role. I must say I rather dislike monitoring roles because it convinces everybody we can do more than we can. The classic one is our petrol monitoring role. We monitor petrol prices. We've got no extra powers under the Act. We just monitor petrol prices. But it conveys to the public that we've got some role in petrol prices. Or we've got an airport monitoring role. And it conveys to the public, I think, we've got a greater role than we do have. But we just have the normal... So we don't really have any role in airport regulation apart from that monitoring role. But I think the issue in terms of pricing of aircraft landing, in terms of pricing of car parks, and the whole investment issue is just getting bigger on the table. So a very rambling answer to your question, I'm afraid.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Aidan Barker, Department of Finance. You spoke earlier about the importance of consumer advocacy in the energy regulation space. I was wondering if you could comment on the consumer advocacy panel in terms of efficacy of both the funding model and also the outcomes from grants that are provided under that model.
Sorry, the last bit of your question? I picked up all just that last phrase I missed, sorry.
Well, there's a model there that provides provides funding for grants.
Yep.
Are the outcomes good?
Look, I just think that doesn't do the trick. I'm not going, I mean, I'm all for consumer advocacy, but the idea that you've got a body and it gives out grants, I mean, what I want is a well-funded consumer body that has on the board of it or in senior positions people who know a lot about regulatory issues but are there to represent a view. So I would want a body that knows it's charged with representing the household view or the small user view, would get out there and consult small users, would have the funding to hire consultants just as the companies who want the price increases have got money to do that, and would have the technical expertise to, dare I say it, even engage in the discussions on what the various components of the cost of capital should be. I've spent my entire career avoiding understanding the various components of the cost of capital, and I'm going to continue that way, but it's a hugely important issue, and I think the consumers have to have the technical expertise to engage in it. Otherwise you're sitting there with the regulator and the large companies arguing what the cost of debt should be. The regulator's trying to think through what the right answer is. The companies are finding 17 different ways to push it up. It'd be nice to have somebody on the other side finding 15 different ways to push it down, and that way the regulator is in a better position. So I just think a lot more funding and a lot more skills, and also a body that represents consumers generally. Consumer bodies, and I understand this and I don't criticise this at all, but generally they recommend that they represent disadvantaged consumers. I'm after a body that can do that, of course, you can't take that away. And the number of consumers who are paying more than 10% of their disposable income from energy in our country is frightening. But the consumer body I want is one that represents all users and plays the general consumer role. So it's a big difference to what we've got now. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. Kelvin Willoughby, Curtin University. I'm wondering whether the ACCC takes much interest in the interplay between competition law and intellectual property law. I think, for example, of the recent fight between Apple and Samsung. In other countries, many people argue that intellectual property law should not be used to allow a company like Apple to enjoy its success in the market the way it does. Do you take an interest in these questions?
Look, I take a bit of an interest in the questions. I have 3 commissioners on the ACCC who, or 2 at least, who are absolutely besotted by the issue. So if you had them here, you probably wouldn't get out of here short of 10 o'clock. And so I must admit to largely leaving the issue to them. So I have not spent a lot of time on the issue. My instinctive reaction is, firstly, there's nothing wrong with copyright per se. It's just like any other asset. And secondly, I think it should just essentially be left to issues of Part 4 rather than having complicated exemptions to Part 4 in relation to copyright issues. But look, I think if I go beyond that, I'm going to be misleading you. It's not an issue I'm an expert on, but I've sure got a couple who are.
Jonathan Barrett at the Financial Review. Just on the proposed tie-up between Qantas and Emirates, is there an issue over that jointly they will decrease capacity out of Australia? And also, is there an issue that Emirates prices might rise to match Qantas's? Yeah,
look, I'll make a general disclaimer, then I'll answer the question as best I can. Obviously, I can't get drawn into this too much because the submissions just come in. I've got a copy in my bag, but I must say I haven't memorised it yet, even though various staff at the ACCC are all over it, but it's very early days in getting on top of it, and of course we've got to go out for consultation, so I don't want to start saying things that can be seen to preempt the issues, but I think it's fair to say, almost at a theoretical or even it's almost tautological, I think, that if you're worried about what are the anti-competitive detriments, then volume and price are the two ways anti-competitive detriments manifest themselves. So I think the answer to your question, you know, are we going to look at capacity issues and pricing issues, almost, as I say, tautologically, has to be yes. I guess to give an example, I mean, obviously, this idea of what benefits Qantas and what benefits the travelling public, just to give a sort of simplistic view of that, I mean, Qantas will naturally say, if you book with us, now you've only got limited access to Europe, but after the tie-up with Emirates, you'll get much better access to Europe. To which one answer is, well, yes, but you could have gone with Emirates in the first place and still had that good access to Europe. So the question for us is, what does this deal give consumers generally that they're not getting now? Not the issue of how does it help Qantas. And we've just got to work our way through that. It's a complex topic. It's complex because you've got to work out what'll happen if the deal goes ahead versus what would have happened if the deal didn't go ahead. And in working out what happens if the deal didn't go ahead, you can look at the past, but of course Qantas are already out there in the public saying, well, the past is no guide to what's going to happen in the future, because if the deal doesn't go ahead, we're going to cut back our services anyway. So all that, I think, just shows what a complex issue this is, why there's only a limited amount I can say, but we're looking at this from the point of view of consumers generally, and therefore price and volume are going to be key issues. And of course we are aware that Emirates prices generally are lower than Qantas prices, so naturally we're concerned we're going to look at the price issue closely.
Rod, Lisa Goldacre from Curtin University. Thank you again. I'd like to echo Dale's comments. It's been a most enjoyable morning. The ACL introduced some significant changes, I guess, for consumers, and I'm thinking mostly of the unfair contracts regime, how consumer guarantees now operate in a different way, and they were introduced for reasons, you know, to improve protection for consumers. Has there been any indication, or does the ACCC feel that it's achieved those outcomes, or are there indications that those provisions are working?
Look, thank you for that question. One of the things, I guess, as you come into a new job, you're struck by a few things, and probably the main, if I had to pick one thing that struck me more than others, it's the under-acknowledgement of the importance of the changes to Australian consumer law. I mean, I still talk to people who say to me, oh, well, the biggest changes were the Hilmer review and Part 3A and the other changes that were made, getting rid of Section 49 and all that sort of stuff. They occasionally talk about the Dawson review. They talk about the criminalisation of cartels, but unquestionably the changes to the ACL, I think, top all of that. And yet you don't get much reporting of it. It's been revolutionary in a number of ways. Frankly, the dominant way is that now we've got penalties we can get under the ACL. I mean, just think about this. We've now had, the new regime came in the middle of 2010. This is one of my best topics, so thank you for asking. And I didn't plant the question either. But the thing came in 2010, and since 2010, and of course the behaviour to attract a penalty has to be post the ACL coming in, we've now had 6 penalties, at least of more than $1 million. And so previously to 2010, we'd have found people doing the wrong thing, and all we could go to court is to get them to stop doing it. Now we can go to court and get them penalised. And it has an amazing influence on the way the media picks up the issue, which is relevant for general compliance in the community. I get the boards of those companies walking through my door saying, what can we do to stop this happening again? Whereas before, you know, they wouldn't have cared less. I mean, why would you care? You went to court and someone said, stop doing something, and you said, okay, I'll stop. Now you get penalties associated with it. It is just a revolution in terms of how effectively you can send compliance messages in relation to not misleading consumers, which, as I say, is essentially what the law is about. So we've had very important cases, and I will run on a little bit here. I'll get back to your question in a second. But we had a over $2 million penalty against Apple for saying that its iPad connected to 4G when it didn't, and yet, of course, you had the Samsung product out there that did connect to 4G. So there was a competition as well as a consumer issue there. We've had communications cases and energy market cases where consumers were misled into thinking they were getting the best deal or thinking they were paying X and getting a certain product when they had to pay more. And so the penalties has had an amazing effect. Secondly, we've got the ability to issue infringement notices, which some don't like. Some people don't like our ability to do that, but it allows us to deal with a whole lot of cases really easily. We had in our carbon work a gymnasium that sent out a letter to everybody saying, you can avoid the impact of the carbon price, and I've forgotten how big they said the impact would be, but it was way exaggerated on what it would be, if you sign up and you renew your membership for 2 or 3 years. Now that was a misrepresentation. Rather than take them to court, they settled fairly quickly and paid an infringement notice. Now it was $6,600. So, but they're a small company. They're a one firm. They run a gymnasium. So what a nonsense. Them going to court, us going to court. We issued the infringement notice. They paid it, and they got a lot of adverse publicity. So I think the fact that they got a fine, even though it was short, meant you got the media attraction. Then, of course, you've had much improved law, and you've mentioned 2 excellent examples, consumer guarantees and unfair contract terms. We've done a lot to publicise the consumer guarantees, and that is working. We have a few enforcement cases underway where we'll be taking some companies to court fairly soon for not adhering to the consumer guarantee policy. So the consumer guarantee policy that's changed means that now you have a statutory right to a replacement or refund of a good if it fundamentally doesn't do what it was meant to do. In the old days, you'd get told by the firm, well, have you got an extended warranty? What does the warranty say? These days, you've got a statutory right. It doesn't matter what the warranty says. If the thing doesn't do what it was meant to do, on a reasonable assessment of what it was meant to do, you've got those inherent rights. So it's a massive change to the consumer law. We've been out there educating people about it. It's an easy one to get out and talk about. We've got more to do. But I think we've done a lot of education. I think we now need some enforcement cases to focus the minds of some companies, and we'll be doing that. Unfair contract terms, we've gone through a lot of contracts. I guess the main one we can all relate to is in my household. I mean, I'm married to a woman who's got a PhD in law, and yet she always let me deal with the mortgages because she said, look, I'm not going to have anything to do with this contract. I refuse to be involved in signing it. Its terms are outrageous. And I said, yes, but it doesn't matter if we pay our mortgage on time. But it did have so we've been able to work with banks and airlines and get those contracts changed. But I think now we're going to be making even more use of unfair contract terms because we're seeing terms in some energy contracts, for example, that are interesting, and so we'll be working on that. So I think it is having a very big effect, and of course it's given us greater powers, the power to issue substantiation notices, which means if somebody says something, and again our consumer law is all about misrepresentations, we can ask them to substantiate it. So I think consumer law has been transformed. I think we are making, I mean, we've put, indeed I've probably spent more of my first year talking about consumer issues than I have about competition. That's because in seeing that the consumer law had been changed, I wanted to make absolutely sure we took full advantage of it and we got the focus on it. And so we've tried to do that. We think it's working okay, but you may have your own perspective on it. So thanks for the question.
Maybe one more, or maybe I'll have to do the... You got more, I'll try one more. I mean, you talked about the role of consumers and whether or not they should be organised or whatever. There's also certain types of consumers who, in a sense, are fleeting, like tourists, for example, or international students. I know we've got people here from Curtin University. Is there Anything particular you can do, or that the ACCC does in terms of those sorts of consumers who, if you like, are sort of a captive market, and then they go back again if their service hasn't been what they actually were looking for in terms of, you know, the advertisements or the appeals to those sorts of consumers? I'm not sure the ACCC does anything on those sorts of grounds.
Look, I haven't. I understand the problem precisely. Having my wife is British, so we have a succession of cousins, then nieces, then nephews, now next generation coming to visit us all the time. So I do see the problem, but that hasn't been an issue that's been raised much with us. So it's not one we're putting much attention to. We get very few complaints, and probably because they just put up with it and go. But in terms of our priorities, trying to make the most of all the ACL issues I just mentioned, dealing with all the other issues, I'm afraid it's not up there on our radar.
Give you one last one. Sorry, Lisa.
Just on the consumer issue, right, I guess one of the criticisms of the ACL is the varied and many definitions of consumer, that there's not one single definition, that adds some complication and perhaps compliance costs. Is there any indication that the ACL will be subject to maybe an amendment so we get a single definition of consumer?
The honest answer is that issue hasn't been raised with me before. So I've only been there for 12 months, and that's not an issue that, with all the other things I've been focusing on, that's come up. And look, as I say, having spent a lot of time on the consumer law issue and dealt with a large number of cases, I haven't had to jump that hurdle. I don't know whether Sam at the back there thinks I'm missing anything, but I don't, and I won't put you in the spot, Sam, but I don't, unless I'm wrong, I don't think it's an issue that slows us down in any of our enforcement cases. I mean, we treat consumers as being we treat consumers as being everyone in this room when you go shopping, but also small business as consumers as well. And we've never had a problem with the definition, so maybe you can... It hasn't, and look, Sam's agreeing, I think. It's not an issue that worries us in a practical sense. It's not holding us back at all.